Okay, so for our last speaker before lunch, we have Vansh Nukala, who's currently working as a certified nursing assistant in Providence Medical Center. He's a recent graduate of University of Washington in biology, and he's going to share with us some of his research on addiction, and his talk is called The Past, Present, and Future of Addiction.
How's it going, everyone? Let me see if the mic's working. Guess it's attached. All right, we can skip the introduction. So, we're a little short on time, so I'm going to try to run through this real quick and leave some time at the end for questions. So, actually, let's go back real quick. I want to just talk about the past, the present, and the future of addiction. And first, we'll start with the past. And what I mean by the past is sort of the evolutionary basis of addiction. First, I want to establish that addiction isn't even a human phenomenon. It's not even exclusive to mammals, actually. Addiction seems to be present throughout all of bilateria. And notably, those learning systems, such as operant conditioning and importantly, associating environmental cues with reward and punishment, seems to be present all throughout bilateria. And there's two experiments that I want to talk about. Crayfish, they self-administer amphetamines when trained to do so. It's called a spatially contingent task, but essentially, if they are provided amphetamines after performing a behavior, they tend to perform the behavior more often than the control group. And interestingly, roundworms actually show preference for stimulants such as cocaine and nicotine. And this preference can be blocked actually by treatments, common treatments for cocaine and nicotine, such as varenicline, which is a treatment for nicotine addiction. And interestingly, naltrexone, which is originally a treatment for opioid addiction. And that's interesting to me because cocaine actually works both through the opioid system and also is a blocks reuptake of monoamines. Why is it that these investigators decided to use naltrexone? I just want you guys to keep that in your mind, and I'll reference that later on. Okay. So why hasn't evolution dealt with addiction? We've been evolving for quite a long while. Why are we still so susceptible to addiction? There's a couple of theories I want to talk about. Okay. So there's two main schools of thought here, mismatches and trade-offs. And I'll talk about mismatches first. So there's a couple pictures on there. Let me see how to work this laser pointer. Oh, yeah. All right. That's going to be difficult. Um, yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I guess I'll just describe it. Okay. So the first one's Costco. And I mean, I work as a CNA, right? I don't get paid the most, but from a single paycheck, I mean, I could feed myself for months, like with Costco. And that was never possible for most of our history. I mean, you'd have to work the entire day for a single day's worth of food. There's another that's a mismatch from our ancestral environment to today's environment. There's another mismatch that's a zoo right there. That wasn't the case. You know, we used to fear those animals. Now we keep them in zoos. Um, right over there, bottom left, we shoot the laser pointer's still going off. Went that away. We live a very sedentary lifestyle compared to our ancestral environment. That's another example of a mismatch. And finally, social media has revolutionized social bonding and facilitated social discussion. I guess I say revolutionized in a positive connotation. I know many of you guys are parents and probably pretty opposed to social media, so it's open to your interpretation. Okay, now talking about mismatches in the context of drug addiction. Again, Costco. Uh, right here, I want to talk about food addiction. Having a food addiction back in the day was hugely adaptive because of how scarce food is. But right now, having a food addiction, I mean, if you have a food addiction and $100 and a day at Costco, I mean, that's not going to end well. Whereas back in the day, having a food addiction would mean you would hoard food and be very successful. Okay. Opiates, this is very straightforward. Back in the day, only opioids were present and at low concentrations, and now we rely on opioids such as heroin, fentanyl, oxycodone. I guess we do still use some opioids now, such as morphine and codeine, but definitely back in the day, they were not present at the concentrations that they are now. Okay, and then the next one, alcohol. Alcohol is a bit more interesting, sticking with the theme of food scarcity. Back in the day, food was very scarce, and calorie-rich ripened fruit actually contained ethanol. So it's a popular theory that we evolved to crave ethanol because it came with the calories of the food. And also, ethanol alcohol facilitated social bonding and led to reproductive success. I mean, I guess it does now as well, but the mismatch between the ancestral environment and present day is the fact that ethanol concentrations have very much increased. You could not find 40% alcohol back in the day. And finally, gambling. This one's also very straightforward, but I'll go into a bit more detail in just a sec. But my point is these evolutionary mechanisms that have been evolving for many years didn't evolve with 40% alcohol, oxycodone, Costco, and the casino next door in mind. We didn't have that for much of our human history. There's no need for a regulatory system if these stimuli weren't present for most of the time. I'm just going to dive a little bit deeper into gambling because I think it's a really good example of a mismatch. Okay, I think I need to pull out the laser pointer for this one. So the first chart here, rats will gamble essentially. The y-axis is the percent of the time they choose the gambling lever as composed to the regular lever. And the x-axis, it looks a bit complicated, but essentially the gambling lever, either you press the lever once to receive food or you press it 40 times to receive food. And that's in comparison to a constant lever of 20 lever presses. Now, the first data point, the first chart where the rats chose it 75% of the time, the 0.5 represents the percent of the time that they win the gambling lever, i.e. they get the one lever press leading to food. So they chose that lever 75% of the time, even though the expected effort is essentially equivalent to the 20 lever presses, right? Does that make sense? Because half the time it's 1, half the time it's 40, whereas the constant lever all the time it's 20. The expected effort is about the same. Yet they chose it 75% of the time. The second one's really interesting to me. The expected effort would be about 30 as compared to the constant lever's expected effort about 20, yet they still chose it over 50% of the time. This just goes to show that uncertainty increases motivation. The same is shown in hummingbirds. And I want you guys to tell me, or think to yourselves rather, what would happen if uncertainty reduced motivation rather than increasing motivation? And think about it in the context of our ancestral environment. Just think about it for a sec. And I'll let you know, our ancestral environment conditions were often patchy, and it's imperative that we persevere during these uncertain environments. That's why it's hugely adaptive for uncertainty to increase motivation rather than reduce it. Even nowadays, people who live in stressful environments or are raised in stressful environments are more prone to gambling. In fact, a study was done. Pathological gamblers show reduced cortisol responses to stressful stimuli as compared to non-gamblers. Of course, this once adaptive mechanism could not have predicted, the existence of casinos and DraftKings and all that. So that's a mismatch. Okay. Now we'll talk about the trade-off hypothesis and a few examples of trade-offs. Actually, I'll tell you what trade-offs are first. A trade-off is where a feature of the human condition has both a positive and a negative aspect to it, but the positive outweighs the negative. Now, an example of that is Alzheimer's disease. Primates actually get Alzheimer's, but they don't experience the rapid neurodegeneration that we do. And it turns out that the rapid evolution of the genes implicated in Alzheimer's disease co-occurred with the complication of the human brain, which is necessary for human dominance, but also led to Alzheimer's. And another good example is sickle cell disease. Sickle cells are protective against malaria, but also lead to sickle cell disease. So it's a trade-off. Now, trade-offs in the context of drug addiction. Why are we so susceptible to addiction? That's what this theory hopes to answer. Let's first quickly establish that addiction consists of overvalued rewards and undervalued risk. Risk and reward are improperly encoded in the mind of an addict in response to addictive stimuli. I mean, it's pretty clear that most drugs have very low reward and very high risk, but that's improperly encoded. Uh, Establishing that, our emotional systems are greatly adaptive, even the negative ones. Our emotional system is designed to help us cope with specific situations, a different emotion for different situations. Even the negative ones are adaptive. For example, pain prevents damage, anxiety prevents dangerous situations, and even the ones that seem outright bad, like a heavy fever, in response to a mild sickness, the cost of overreacting is far less than the cost of underreacting. Now, to talk about the pleasure aspect of our emotional system, this is greatly adaptive as well. It's in place to increase fitness. It helps us seek food and seek reproductive success, which is highly adaptive. We not only seek it, we very strongly seek it. Humans have an unsatisfiable mind. No sooner do we accomplish one goal than our satisfaction fades, prompting us to pursue another. It's not that I'm not happy with what I have, but I always want more. However, the system, as you guys might guess, is just very easily hijacked by drugs. The system is necessary for human dominance, but it's very susceptible, sort of like a trade-off. So that's the trade-off hypothesis for drug addiction. And Randolph Nesse, whose papers I referenced for this part of the presentation, he had a quote. He said that drugs are like a magnet in a compass of the mind. And I thought that was a pretty good way of putting it. Okay. This slide, I just thought it was like a pretty cool hunter-gatherer stepping from one environment to the other. It's AI generated. Uh, but yeah, he evolved to conquer his environment, but wasn't prepared for the mismatches of the modern day environment. Nearly every deficiency in the human condition can be explained by mismatches and trade-offs, or simply constraints on selection. There's very little natural selection nowadays. Obviously, we can't artificially induce that. That would just be eugenics. So it's better to explore treatment. So right now, I'm going to step into the present aspect of this presentation. So this is my research. I just want to talk about these two pathways and ignore the locations on the two brains. This was also AI generated, so it's just inaccurate. But the relevant aspect of this is the names, okay? And I'm going to reference these names a little bit. Let's talk about the mesolimbic pathway first. So it's a pathway connecting the VTA and the nucleus accumbens. And this pathway is responsible for reward, pleasure, and motivation, essentially goal-directed behavior. That's what I want you guys to keep in mind. The second pathway, the nigrostriatal pathway, connects the substantia nigra and the dorsal striatum. And this is responsible for habitual behaviors, movement, implicated in Parkinson's. So just keep these two in mind. I'll reference them a little bit later on. Okay, so this is the key core of my research. Dopamine oppositely regulates different stages of addiction. So during the initial goal-directed phase, the drug response, dopamine signaling, so dopamine signaling in response to taking the drug is high, and dopamine response to the cues, drug cues, the cues in our experiment where rats were in a self-administration task in a box, essentially, every time they pressed a lever, a light would turn on and a sound would play. Those are the cues, but you can imagine cues in the real world would be different, like, a party setting or wherever your dealer hangs out or, whatever it is. The cue-dependent dopamine signaling is low. This is during the initial goal-directed phase of addiction. And tonic dopamine signaling, which is just background dopamine signaling, is moderate. And during the habitual phase, this reverses. Dopamine signaling in response to the drug is much lower, but dopamine signaling in response to cues is much higher, and tonic dopamine signaling is lower. Not only that, but signaling shifts from the nucleus accumbens to the dorsal striatum. Now, if I'm going to go back a slide, that's from that mesolimbic goal-directed pathway to the nigrostriatal pathway. So keeping these facts in mind, we can formulate our research questions. Can we restore this weakened drug response dopamine during that second part of addiction? We call that the escalation part of addiction. This is where overdoses occur. This is where physical dependency occurs. And can we dampen the cue-dependent dopamine signaling? this is how we want to treat addiction. Now, this was done in a rat model with cocaine, but theoretically could be applied to any drug. However, cocaine is important because there actually are no good treatments for stimulant use disorders. And remember when I talked about the roundworms at the beginning, why they use naltrexone? It's because they had nothing for cocaine. We found that levodopa Parkinson's treatment does a decent job actually at modulating dopamine. Right now we have a project going on investigating DOI, which is a psychedelic, and its role in modulating dopamine. And I am investigating cannabis's role in modulating dopamine. Cannabis has some, on top of playing its own role in influencing dopamine signaling, it has some interesting effects on habit formation. So yeah, that's sort of my current research and what we're doing right now. Different drugs interact with the system differently. I guess I don't think about it. I probably should have put some more words on the slides, but real quick running through them. So we talked about cocaine. Cocaine blocks monoamine reuptake. So that's dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. Amphetamines do this and also release these monoamines into the synapse. Opioids are a bit more complex, but they work through the mu opioid receptors and the beta endorphins that are downstream of that. It's what's responsible for pain and pleasure. And there's also two other types of dopamine or opioid receptors, the delta opioid receptor and the kappa opioid receptor. And these are upregulated and downregulated in various areas depending on the stage of addiction. Alcohol is weakly dopaminergic, but its main effect is through, again, this opioid system. Cannabis works through the endocannabinoid system and the CB1 receptors. Nicotine works through nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. The point is, they all interact with the system in different ways, but by investigating this same basic principle of the oppositely varied dopamine signaling and this dorsolateral striatum shift from pathway 1 to pathway 2, that mesolimbic pathway to the nigrostriatal pathway, is how we aim to treat addiction. So investigating how modulating it, how we can modulate it is worthwhile. Okay. Now let's talk about some future treatments. As someone who works with pharmacological interventions to treat addiction, I can say that they're not very good. Nor is cognitive behavioral therapy. I mean, it has its place, but in terms of treating drug addiction, some sources say that 85% of addicts relapse within 1 year of treatment, which is just not a great number. So we need to find better treatments for addiction. And I want to talk about one, it's deep brain stimulation. Okay, let's pull out the laser pointer for this. Okay, so there's a real quick telling you how deep brain stimulation works. There is a pulse generator right there, which then controls the electrode that's implanted into a certain region of the brain, whichever region you choose. And the signaling can be both excitatory or inhibitory. There's very sparse data in terms of its use for addiction, but mechanistically it makes sense. And in some human and animal studies, there have been generally positive outcomes. For example, I'll talk about one, high frequency deep brain stimulation of the substantia nigra, which is exactly or essentially what the treatment is for Parkinson's. It promotes extinction of a methamphetamine-induced conditioned place preference, which sounds complex, but it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a preference for a place that has been conditioned via meth. It promotes extinction of that in rats. So generally some promising data coming from some human and animal studies. And the targets that would be in mind are deep brain stimulation of the nucleus accumbens and the substantia nigra, which are, again, part of those two pathways that I've been talking about. There are, of course, some challenges to deep brain stimulation. This is the picture on the left. That's the state of many addicts, especially those in the progressed state of addiction. And deep brain stimulation is very, very costly. Some numbers I saw were 30 to 45 grand, which is just not something that they can afford. So what good is treatment if those who really need it can't even get it? Some other barriers, it's hard to obtain informed consent. A topic I've been exploring recently is the existence of free will or not. I found that pretty interesting. Just going off on a little tangent here. If you don't know what you're going to think next, how can you claim authorship of your thoughts if you don't know what you're going to think next? Whether or not it exists, that's a topic for another day, but at least the illusion of free will certainly breaks down in an addict. So if we're not even sure if they're providing informed consent, how can we progress with this treatment? Another barrier, addiction is criminalized in some regions of the world. And of course, this procedure is highly invasive. So if governments might mandate this procedure, that's another barrier that's to consider. And the picture on the right, I just included that picture to show how complex the human brain is. If we want to contrast it with something like cardiology, we know everything about everything in the heart. It's like Newtonian physics, we know everything. Whereas the brain, we don't know very much about anything. It's like non-Newtonian physics. We don't know what does what. We're still investigating it. So I think a barrier that we have to overcome is to better understand the brain before we can progress with something as invasive as deep brain stimulation. Okay. So let's apply what we learned. Let's just kind of review what we talked about, and I want to talk about it in the context of stigma for addiction. So just laying down some facts. Some sources say that 40 to 70% of addiction is heritable. So essentially what that means is 40% of the difference between 40 to 70% of the difference between an addict and a not addict can be explained solely by genetics. Genetics, again, that they did not choose. In my research, I didn't mention something. We have a subset of rats called non-escalators. They don't respond to the behavioral paradigm of increased cocaine addiction or increased cocaine access. And there's clearly a genetic component of addiction. And your environment also matters. For example, if I grew up with parents who are victims of addiction and neglectful and around poor peer influences, I might have succumbed to addiction, but I didn't. I grew up with great parents and pretty good friends. So is that really something I can, pat myself on the back for? I didn't choose my genes nor my environment, nor did an addict. The point I'm trying to make here is that yeah, we didn't choose any of that. And even if an addict gets lucky and manages a period of abstinence, we learned about how cues evoke dopamine signaling. Cues are present everywhere. I just want to say that we're really controlled by our neurotransmitters. Going back a little more, we learned about the evolutionary significance of these systems and why they're still present. We learned about environmental mismatches, the fact that they evolved in a different time, these evolutionary systems, and now all these new stimuli are present, and we just weren't really equipped to handle them. We learned how difficult it is to treat addiction. So why is it that addiction is still stigmatized? I want you guys to think about that. I think maybe it's just because this knowledge isn't very widely available and widely known, but the only way to combat addiction is to push back against the stigma with this knowledge. In that way, we get more funding and more support. And that's the only way we can make leaps and bounds in the field of addiction medicine. So those are my references, and I'll try my best to answer any questions. I'm by no means an expert, but still I'll try my best.